This is the Live Forever documentary by John Dower. It tells the story of the rise and fall of Britpop in the 1990s, and right after the opening credits the camera moves immediately to a small man-made island in between Liverpool and Manchester in the north of England, called Spike Island. And the story of Britpop starts there because that was the crowning achievement of the Stone Roses in their heyday. A live concert in front of over 35,000 people, which marked the high point of their careers and the peak of their ascendancy before things went wrong. So today I want to tell you guys the story of Spike Island, but to really understand what happened we have to roll back the clock a little bit further. In the early 80s, a nightclub was opened in Manchester called the Hacienda, and it was opened under the wing of local indie record label Factory Records. Located in a former warehouse, the nightclub opened in 1982, and by 1984, groundbreaking Manchester indie band The Smiths had already played there 3 times. Mike Pickering was a DJ at the Hacienda, and in the first half of the 80s he heard a demo of a local band called the Happy Mondays, and as a result of his hearing that demo they were signed to Factory Records. The Happy Mondays' first album was released in 1985, and they also played at the Hacienda regularly. Also in 1985, a man by the name of Howard Jones, who was a manager at the Hacienda, left his job to start managing an up-and-coming local band called the Stone Roses. In 1986, the Hacienda became one of the first clubs in the UK to start playing house music. In 1987, the Stone Roses released a single called Sally Cinnamon, which reached number 46 in the UK charts. And in 1988, the Hacienda launched an acid house night called Hot. And at this time, ecstasy was on the rise as the clubbers' drug of choice. Rising ecstasy use in nightclubs was beginning to merge with a massive explosion of northern musical talent. And that melting pot that covered rock and roll right the way across to acid house and dance music was called Madchester. Expanding from its Manchester base, the movement went from strength to strength. In 1988, the Stone Roses released the song Elephant Stone as a single, and the Happy Mondays released a song called Rope for Luck. And by this point, ecstasy use was everywhere. Acid house had broken into the mainstream, Madchester was a recognised movement. But I'm not going to go too deep into the full story of Madchester in this video, I just want to give you guys the context for what happened next. So now, let's home in on the main band that emerged as the frontrunners from the Madchester scene, the Stone Roses. In 1989, the Stone Roses released their debut album. It reached 32 in the UK album charts, but it became a slow grower with a constantly increasing reputation through word of mouth. At that time, the profile of the band was also raised significantly by an appearance on The Late Show where there was a power cut, and this happened.
Well, I'm sorry about that. Looks like we've had a power shortage or something, so we'll move on to the next item. And Martin Parr is one of Britain's leading photographers, known for his innovative colour work and for creating a new school of British documentary photography. We'll do it. We'll sort it out in a minute. His latest book, The Cost of Living, chronicles how the comfortable classes spend their time and money. But like some of his previous work, the latest photographs are controversial. Critics allege he's exploiting his subjects rather than making social commentary.
Amateurs! That same year, the Stone Roses and the Happy Mondays appeared on the same episode of Top of the Pops, proving conclusively to any doubters that Madchester had now gone mainstream. The Happy Mondays performed Step On, and the Stone Roses performed Fool's Gold. Both songs entered the UK top 10. And riding on the wave of the success of the Fool's Gold single, the Stone Roses' debut album moved up to number 19 in the charts. In the NME that year, readers chose the Stone Roses for Band of the Year, Best New Band, Single of the Year for the song Fool's Gold, and Album of the Year. By 1990, the cultural impact of Madchester had become so widespread that the University of Manchester was the most applied for uni in the whole of the UK that year. The Stone Roses began selling out shows all over the UK in 1989. They played a famous headline gig at Blackpool's Empress Ballroom to 4,000 people. After that, they took things up a level by playing for a crowd of 7,000 people at London's Alexandra Palace. And, after the London gig, the band decided to go for broke. To set the scene a little more for what came next, I'd like to read to you from John Robb's excellent book, The Stone Roses. In 1989 and 1990, it seemed like anything could happen. Self-belief, boosted by ecstasy and the acid house boom, were all coming together and affecting the rock scene. People were hungry for big spaces and big ideas. The Stone Roses were rewriting the rulebook, and if acid house was all about the communal rush of the rave, then why couldn't rock and roll replicate this? At the time, having just emerged from the American hair metal dominated culture of the 80s, the Stone Roses did not want to gig in the typical rock and roll circuit. Rather than being associated with what mainstream rock and roll had become, they wanted to do their own concert on their own terms in a location of their own choosing. After visiting various different sites all around the country, the band's management in the end settled on Spike Island, booking it for a concert on Sunday the 27th of May 1990. And just to give you some idea of the scale of the leap they were hoping to make, their biggest gig to date had been a sellout gig of 7,000. They were now hoping to do a sellout gig of 35,000. In April, they put one single advert in the NME and the event sold out. Ticket sales, which generated approximately £400,000, only just covered the cost of actually putting on the event. On the day before the concert, the Stone Roses held a press conference which has now passed into legend. And to help tell that story, I'd like to read to you an excerpt from Simon Spence's War and Peace. Close to 100 representatives of the world's press gathered for a press conference at the Piccadilly Hotel in Manchester. Evans, their manager, saw the opportunity to make money out of the press conference and asked the BBC and ITV national news crews to pay to attend. Even when it was pointed out to him this was an absurd demand, he would not back down and refused them free access. As a result, the event was denied slots on the national news. Late, as usual, the Stone Roses mooched into the room. The atmosphere got tenser and there was a curious silence as the band sat down. "Why don't you ask something? You've flown here from all over the world," Ian Brown sneered at the not-so-merry throng. There was plenty of foot shuffling. No one really felt like being the first to talk in such a hostile atmosphere. The NME reported the opening exchanges. A journalist asked Ian, "Do you take a lot of drugs?" Ian shot back, "Do you take a lot of drugs?" The journalist replied no, and Brown said, "Well, that's all right then, innit? Turn on, tune in, but don't drop out." The Roses answered a few questions politely, but dismissed others out of hand, with Brown challenging the press to come up with better lines of inquiry. their answers grew more flippant and defensive. It appeared to many now that the band were on some sort of colossal wind-up. A journalist asked them, "When are you coming to America?" "When you send us the ticket," Manny replied. "Answer the question," the indignant journalist responded. "We are," said Manny. Another journalist asked, "Are you guys prepared for this press conference?" Reni responded, "We never went to school for press conferences." Another journalist asked, "How do you think Americans will appreciate Manchester sarcasm?" Ian Brown responded, saying, "With an American accent." The journalists were also interrupted by local stand-up comedian Caroline Ahern. The band knew her, but pretended they didn't, playing along with her assertion that she was a journalist. She insisted she had a really important question to ask, and then asked them what their favourite colour was. NME's Helen Mead asked them how they felt about being the star attractions in this little zoo, and they just made a load of monkey noises for an answer. An American journalist said, "The question of where you see yourselves in 5 years is a legitimate question." Ian Brown responded, "It's not a legitimate question, it's a stupid question." A different US journalist asked, "Do you feel excited by all that's happening around you?" Brown responded, "Excited? No, I'm bored. I'm waiting for someone to make me laugh." The tabloids, represented by the Daily Star, asked about sex, drugs, rock and roll. Ian Brown, feigning intense boredom, stared glumly out at the audience. The room was crackling with tension. A journalist said, "John, are you ever going to speak?" John responded by just saying no. A different journalist asked him if he thought he was the best guitarist in the world. He responded by just saying yes. At this point, no one in the audience really knew what to do, and no wonder. Although it's all very funny in hindsight, it must have been incredibly uncomfortable and super awkward to be there. And because the band were behaving so bizarrely, the questions began to dry up. The band's photographer began to heckle the press, saying, "Why the fuck are you all here? Why are you all afraid to ask the band any questions?" Ian Brown responded, "It's because we don't answer them." A journalist then said, "You've invited all these people here, but won't answer any questions?" Ian Brown responded, "I've answered all the questions, except the stupid ones." Ian Brown then belched and asked if anyone had any cigarettes. A journalist asked Ian Brown about his background. Brown responded, "I'm not telling you." Because the band weren't answering questions properly, or were just not answering them at all, the journalists had realised the whole thing was a bit of a circus, and they'd started to give up, and this apparently angered Ian Brown. Ian Brown said, "Who has come from the other side of the world? Hands up, you're being paid to ask the questions." A journalist responded, "I paid my own airfare, so fuck you, man." Ian Brown simply replied by going, "Ooh." At this point, Frank Owen from Details magazine yelled, "This is fucking bullshit. I'm from Manchester and this is bullshit. You're treating these people like fucking shit. I'm from here. I know when you're fucking winding people up. You're behaving like pigs to these people. Why are you dissing all these people here? Why don't you answer the questions? These people came all this way and you won't answer the questions properly." The band looked baffled. "What questions?" they replied. Ian Brown then looked up with a vacant stare and said, "I think you've got the right stick but the wrong end." A member of the band's management then grabbed the mic and shouted into it, "How the fuck do you think the band feel sat up there in complete silence with all you bastards staring at them, asking them fuck all? You come all this way, drink all the free beer, and you haven't asked fucking shit. You're a bunch of fucking wankers in whatever language you speak. If I was them, I'd fuck off now." And with that, the press conference came to an end. And so, after the train wreck disaster of the press conference, the band packed down their gear from their rehearsal space and headed over to Spike Island to start setting up and sound checking. Brown strolled around the site, happily chatting to gangs of local kids hanging about. When the police approached to warn the kids they shouldn't be there, Brown grew agitated and had to be dragged away by a crew member. The organisation of the event seemed to be slipping away from the band, and this, together with the disappointing press conference and the confusion over support acts, added to a sense of foreboding. Hundreds of locals had already signed a petition in an attempt to have the gig cancelled. Barges had been driven down the canal to try and knock down access bridges, and the drinks licence had only just been reinstated after having been revoked at short notice. After setup and soundcheck, that night the band partied into the small hours in Didsbury, and the sun rose on Sunday the 27th of May, the day of reckoning. On the day of the event itself, attendance was actually closer to 40,000 people. 32,500 tickets had been sold, there were 5,000 people on the guest list, and another 2,500 were estimated to have crawled under the fences. And there was no shortage of crises on the day. Just to add to the kind of bolted together feel of the whole thing, no one had thought to check the tides. It was a full moon at the end of May, and something called a neap spring tide was coming in.
The words piss up and brewery spring to mind on that one. You'd think if you was on the Mersey estuary, someone would have the foresight to check on whether the tide's going to be unusually high that day, you know what I mean?
On the day of the concert, the water was rising all around Spike Island, and it got to the point where the police told the band, if it gets 1 yard higher, we have to evacuate the whole island. But thankfully, the Mersey didn't rise that final yard, and the event was able to go ahead. In many other respects too, the event hadn't been properly planned or thought out. Some of the band's choices, especially for the support slot lineup, seemed very random indeed. And while each of them may have been solid musical acts in their own right, they seemed oddly mismatched for the Spike Island lineup. There was last-minute confusion over the support acts and running order for the event. The Roses had made it plain they didn't want it to be a Madchester festival. The DJs who had supported the band at Blackpool and London were invited. Reni wanted a drum-based support act, so the drum orchestra of the Lion King of Zimbabwe was booked. An outfit called On You Sound System were booked, and an American DJ called Frankie Bones.
And Reni, what else made you cry? It's acceptance of these people who are fighting for survival and the right to be free. Yeah, we disagree.
The drum orchestra and the On You sound system played to an apparently indifferent crowd. Paul Oakenfield, who had been booked and paid for a 2-hour DJ set, had his set cut to just 40 minutes to make way for the other DJ, Frankie Bones. And just to make everything even more confusing, the Stone Roses hadn't told anybody what the support lineup would be, what time anyone was coming on stage, or what time they themselves were coming on stage.
Just remember they'd been there all fucking day. Thank God it wasn't raining. I know the support bands were fucking atrocious. Whoever put that bill together had no sense of the event.
DJ Paul Oakenfield said this: "The Roses made it hard on their fans. You had kids turning up at 2 p.m. expecting the band to be on, and they had to wait until 9 p.m. And they're basically indie kids, so they don't want Frankie Bones playing house music."
Nice one, nice one. That's what it's about, expression. 9/10 of the law.
By mid-afternoon, the high tide had passed, and the only danger now was the growing unrest and tension in the crowd as they waited and waited for the band. The sun was still high in the sky, and there was little shelter. It was hot and dusty. People were parched and hungry, and in total 27 people were hospitalised. Fortunately, there were no fatalities. As late afternoon turned into early evening, the atmosphere was severely flagging. Despite the efforts of the DJs, there remained an atmosphere of near exhaustion and ill temper among the huge crowd. Then, at 9 p.m, after having kept their fans and followers waiting in the dust, heat, chemicals and discarded needles for 7 hours, the band finally took to the stage. For the fans, it was a great day out. Carl, who was 21 at the time, still remembers it clearly, saying, "It was like a giant party, man. We felt free, at ease in the field. Me and some mates from Preston just went down there and we got totally stoned. We were out of it. The Roses were amazing that day. I don't care what anyone says. That was such a great day out." Several future members of Oasis were also in attendance. Paul Bonehead Arthurs took a van full of mates in a specially Stone Roses style customised vehicle, and also, separately, a young Noel Gallagher was also in attendance. Noel remembers the gig as being terrible technically, but still an incredible experience.
The sound was shit. They played a fucking blinder, you know, but you couldn't hear anything because the wind was coming in off the whatever fucking river it is off the Mersey and blowing this, and you could hear it in bits and pieces.
The gig for me was a bit of a non-event. I think we played okay, but the wind was blowing the sound that way when the people was over there kind of thing. It was pretty badly thought out.
Dave Barnett says a similar thing in The Guardian. "History tells me that the Stone Roses at Spike Island was, in musical terms, awful. The band seemed bored, the sound was weak. Thousands of people crammed into a field surrounded by chemical factories to watch one of the most ill-advised, badly organised and shambolic gigs ever held. My memory tells me something different. High metal fences gave it the feel of a high-security prison. This was 12 years before Glastonbury installed theirs. It seemed impenetrable, even for those with tickets. Nobody seemed to know how you got in. Everybody was off their head. There weren't enough toilets, nor enough drink, nor enough space. There was an aura of menace. At Glastonbury, amid the shiny happy people and middle-class kids dropped off by their parents, there were always knots of shirtless lads who seemed half a pill away from getting violent. That Sunday afternoon, it seemed they constituted the entire population of Spike Island. But then, the music started. By the time the Stone Roses came on after sunset, people were climbing on the sound towers and dancing anywhere they could find a square of space. The sound was appalling and their performance was messy, and yet nobody cared. Driving home in the Chorley Guardian van, somebody said, "Well, that's the 80s over." It felt true. DJ Haslam said, "Spike Island was a full stop, and there was a sense we were entering a new chapter." Bob Stanley of Melody Maker said Spike Island was a horrible field surrounded by huge electricity pylons, factories and chemical plants. Your hair felt very odd and greasy, like it was totally coated with chemicals from the factories. The best thing about it was being able to say you were there. After Spike Island, the Stone Roses played a gig in Belfast in their own 7,000 capacity big top tent, and then they played another one in Glasgow. And sadly, the gig in Glasgow was the final time the Stone Roses performed on stage with Reni on drums during their late 80s, early 90s heyday. After the gig, the band disappeared for years, entering into long, protracted legal wrangles with their record company and vanishing down the studio rabbit hole at Rockfield Studios in South Wales, trying to both write and record the Second Coming album. As the years dragged on, the band slowly began to fracture and eventually disintegrated entirely, with Oasis and Britpop rising up to fill the vacuum they left behind. Now, of course, the Stone Roses did reunite 22 years later. They played some huge shows all around the world, some bigger than Spike Island. But that was different. They played those gigs as long-established legacy artists. In their true heyday, when they had just emerged as leaders of a new musical movement, Glasgow Green turned out to be their last gig. And Spike Island, for all of its shambolic disorganisation, had been their bittersweet, crowning achievement.